You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
Growing up, I was taught that there really is one way that we might come to faith, and really one story that anyone who would come to faith would tell. And to even be on alert that those who would share the stories that didn't quite match up to those stories, that one story that we had heard, may not actually be of the faith that we would share. But as I have progressed in my faith, I can't help but hear stories from other people and allow these other stories to let me see that there are infinite ways that people might come to faith in God, and that God might enter the life and speak to someone. And so as we are moving through Acts, we find ourselves now in the latter part of the story where Luke, as the writer of both his gospel and the account in Acts, becomes a part of the story. The pronouns now change to we because Luke is participating in the life of seeing the gospel spread to his people, other Gentiles. And so in Acts chapter 16, we hear a little bit of how Luke is remembering how people came to faith and inviting us to remember our stories as well. So Luke writes, "During the night, Paul had a vision, and there stood a man of Macedonia pleading with him and saying, 'Come over to Macedonia and help us.' And when he had seen the vision, we immediately tried to cross over to Macedonia, being convinced that God had called us to proclaim the good news to them. And so we set sail from Troas and took a straight course to Samothrace, and then the following day to Neapolis, and from there to Philippi, which is the leading city of the district of Macedonia and a Roman colony. And we remained in this city for some days. And on the Sabbath day, we went outside the gate by the river, where we supposed there was a place of prayer. And we sat down and spoke to the women who had gathered there. And a certain woman named Lydia, a worshiper of God, was listening to us. She was from the city of Thyatira and a dealer in purple cloth. The Lord opened her heart to listen eagerly to what was said by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she urged us, saying, 'If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come and stay at my home.' And she prevailed upon us." And so Luke is in this final act of his account of the early church, as the characters finally accomplish what was promised at the very beginning of this account. We have followed this trajectory from Jerusalem to Judea to the Hellenized cities, and now the gospel is slipping past the borders and into the rest of the world. The church's message will travel much further than this in the future, but here's the moment where Christianity becomes a worldwide movement, where it escapes those who mostly only know of the Judean God. In a generation from now, the world will be changed. And so Luke is writing this in part to highlight the need for every follower of Christ to follow this call to tell others of the good news. That those who have both been sort of ordained by the Spirit to be those pastors and preachers who would make the proclamation, as well as those who would just get caught up in the story like Luke has himself. That we are a people who have been brought back to life, told to awake from our slumber, open the curtains and see the new morning. And yet there are others who sleep, who don't know that the dawn has come, and so we must go to them, is the way Luke tells the story. Paul hears a call like this, responds immediately. It almost seems like he's waking up like right at the crack of dawn, like, "All right, guys, pack your bags, we're going to Macedonia." And they jump from port to port until he arrives there in Philippi, which, as we read Paul's letter to the Philippians, we discover it's one of the churches that brings him most joy. Of all the other churches he helped to start, this church, from this spontaneous call of God, is the one who has brought him the most joy. Eventually, as they wait for an opportunity to come, they encounter Lydia, and then her household comes to hear the good news and gladly accept it. And from there is where the church first begins. When she says that she wants them to stay at her home, she's basically saying, "I want y'all to start a church right here in the living room." And it's fitting that this reading comes to us in the lectionary on Memorial Day weekend, a time when we remember the heroes of our past, the sacrifices that they made in order to bring us comfort and a future. We take a time of rest in order to reflect upon the meaning of the memories that we have, to imagine how the world was made different because of them. And so I'd like us to take up our Christian heritage and memory this morning and consider how we are called within this long legacy of faithfulness. And so since I can't do that for you, I'm going to do that for me. But in my telling some of my story, I'd like you to think and remember your own. And what I'd like us to begin with is to think about your earliest memory of encountering a God who loved you. Often those moments where we feel overwhelmed by something bigger than us, and yet not rejected by that bigness, but instead brought into it, that we belong within that presence of God's love. That is a moment that we receive as good news. There may be some, sermons or some stories or some encounters that we have had in the name of Christ that come off as bad news. I won't discount that. Those things that hit us in a way that we think, surely God can't be like that. But I do think that we all, somewhere often when we're young, encounter God's presence in those surprising ways. In a way that we know what we mean when we say good news. And often that good news is news that will also be good for someone else. The good news for me, when my parents divorced, it felt like my world fell apart. My dad had literally disappeared from the house one day. My mom was doing everything she could just to make ends meet, and I was an incredibly lonely kid. Often thinking about how absent must the world be of love when a father prefers not to be around his kids. And I felt in the midst of that then, I had a lot to prove. To prove to myself that love existed and that it could find me, that everything would be okay. And a friend invited me to church one day. We were not religious by any stretch of the imagination. And so on a whim, I went. And that was a time when, the youth did sit in church and didn't go some other place. And so I was in 8th grade and I heard my pastor quote a psalm that said, "Even though my father and mother may leave me, God will never abandon me." And my hope became real. And then later, as I would read about the lengths that God would go to show that kind of love to other people, I find myself captured by this truth that God loves this broken kid. But it wasn't just this kid that God loved. I found myself moved to talk about that aspect of who God was to other people who felt like I did. My call to ministry came when I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when I accepted that call and said yes. Because, you're confronted with this question, what do you want to do with your life? And imagine a future that you can't even fathom being, multiples of the entire life that you've lived. And I thought, well, if I could help others know what I have come to know, that would be a life well lived. If I could do for others what other people in ministry have done for me, that would be it. The first church I served, that meant driving the church van to the bad parts of town so that I could pick up poor and Black and Hispanic kids and bring them to church. That did not make me popular among the church leadership, especially when I said, hey, if we're going to pay for church members to go to spring break vacations and church camps and everything else, we should pay for everybody, especially the poor Black, Hispanic kids who've been coming. Also not a popular move. I quickly found myself at the second church I worked at, and there I was serving with, it was kind of the rich big church in town, but eventually we started seeing kids with black fingernails and purple hair and Metallica t-shirts coming to church. The punk and goth kind of kids who would listen to My Chemical Romance and whatever else, and they also found that God loved them. They discovered that they had a place. The church members hated what they wore on Sunday. There was a whole meeting that was had about that. And I was like, hey, if you tell the kid to wear his best and he wears a Metallica t-shirt, that's on you. But over the past 30 years of my Christian life, I've been drawn to connect with skeptics or outcasts, people who, for whatever reason, found themselves on the outside of the church and a connection with God, because I had been there too. I'd counted myself part of them, to the point where I've even today feel more at home with them than I do those who've been born and raised in the faith, church members as long as they can imagine. And so I want you to think then, as we imagine not only the time we first encountered God, the time we came to know what good news meant before we could even maybe define, what the Bible would say about it. That often those ways that God would come to us would be the way then that God sends us out. Not necessarily in these sort of blinding moments of trance or visions or whatever would be happening here, but in the deep sense of knowing who I am, that God would say yes to me, that God would call me, invite me, welcome me. It's one of those things where we're turned right back out to go for other people who might feel the same way, to engage with them and tell them the story that was told to us. I was a senior in high school when I decided that I would devote my life to ministry in the church. My mom was not happy with that choice. Thinking about it and having memories about that time, the church that I was invited to was a fundamentalist Baptist church, more conservative than the Southern Baptist. Think about that. That was the place I found myself in. The person who invited me to church, though, would later come out as gay once he escaped the pull of our small hometown in Texas. And so from seemingly opposite worlds, somehow both deeply influenced my faith, deeply provided meaning to my faith. And I think about the way that my story has led me to who and where I am today, and how I could have never predicted it. And I would imagine some of my mentors are ashamed that they may have participated in such a story. But that is what God showing up can do. That is what the Spirit of God does, is interrupt our life, just like with Paul and Luke and others, and take us to places we cannot imagine, among a people we can't anticipate, so that something powerful within the gospel might happen. Now, few of you here have been called to full-time ministry, professional Christianity. And yet, nevertheless, regardless of when you came to faith or when it became meaningful for you, there's an invitation for you to devote your life to good news. In the same way that these high school students are anticipating a future based on the things that they have found that give them joy or hope or encouragement or challenge, all of us have this sort of calling. You might find that calling among your family or your friends. You might find that the idea of faith and hope shines brightest among other committed Christians or people who've become devoted skeptics, whatever that may be. What we find is that in Luke's story, those who receive the faith cannot keep it to themselves. It's become so powerful and life-changing that they can't imagine not working it into conversation, right? Just like if you saw a great movie and you just got to make sure people know, that season 2 of Andor is even better than season 1 of Andor, and you should, a lot of my Bible study people have heard this several times already. It's required viewing. But that we become evangelists, good newsers, telling people about what we have come to experience in the hopes that they could experience a little bit of what we have found. And so the insight that God has given you, I don't want us to discount this. Again, I grew up being told that there was one path to follow, one way to get in, one way to walk it, one way to leave it. And so the telling of the story was not really all that compelling because we've heard that 1,000 times before. But the truth of the matter is the way Paul would describe this in other writings of his would be that there's this multifaceted mystery of God, that it's like a jewel we look through, and every cut shines a different light upon the reality that no one can really fully grasp. And so we need everyone to talk about what they know, what they've come to see, how you've been engaged with the life of God in a way that you bring something important to the story that's being told. Sometimes we know what that important message might be, sometimes we don't, but it's important that we talk about it, that we embody it, that we live in a way that it is nothing else that we can do. That the insight that God has given you through your ups and downs, through the stories and films and TVs and books that you find compelling, speak to a heart that deep down communes with this eternal and universal Christ. This wisdom that you have been given now all comes together so we might not simply remember our faith, but imagine it as it encounters and adapts to whatever comes next. That's the power of the gospel to me, is that while it is known and provides a sense of not certainty, but groundedness, that groundedness can stand on whatever unstable reality that might be up there in the future. That I can look back and say, if God has been faithful to me up to this point, that God will be faithful to me tomorrow. And so what step of faith then might I take? What step of faith might you take in finding new ways to experience the love of God, hear the stories of others who've been on a very different path of yours, and yet nevertheless find a sense of belonging and welcome, so that it's not just you who discover faith, but all that you would call part of your household, your friends and family and neighbors, community members. And so my hope is that we would be a people who would say that all of our life has been given to us as a gift from God. And so all of our life can be devoted. In every hobby and relationship and calling and interaction, all of those are needed so that we might find the good news not only continuing to wake us up and cause us to move, but to invite others to do the same.